Mr Speaker.
Gareth Hughes, 5-minute call.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. Mr Speaker, according to the Bible, it only took 7 days to form the earth and all the plants and animals on it, yet Bill English, managing a so-called rock star economy, hasn't been able to achieve this over 7 years. Of course, this was National's 7th budget. It continues 7 years of deficits, debt, dairy dependence, declining home ownership. It seems the only indicator which isn't going backwards for National is our greenhouse gas emissions, which we know are just going up and up. Now, Mr Speaker, the budget did nothing for a whole generation of young Kiwis who are swimming in student debt. They can't get into their first home, and for those Kiwi workers, of which half of them have seen their wages stagnate under National. After 7 years, our economy is more dependent on a few raw commodities. We're more simple than when we started. Just this week, we saw a massive $2.6 billion trade deficit, the largest in 6 years since the middle of the worst global recession we've seen in decades. What we've seen is now the impacts of the falling dairy prices, but also the dependence our country has on exporting this raw milk powder around the world. Likewise, you can see it with the data we saw in the budget. The horses that the national government have picked aren't working. We've seen the oil royalty income down 38%, minerals income down 34%. We've seen coal royalty income down 33%. On the other side of the ledger, though, we've also seen flat to declining science funding. Tertiary education has seen $1 billion stripped out of it over the last 7 years. We've seen New Zealand continue to languish in the bottom half of the OECD, so we're going backwards on the important things like science and innovation, yet we're increasing our dependence on things like dairy and oil, which aren't paying off. So you can see it in the perilous state of the country's books that Bill English showed us, but you can also see it in the experience of the majority of Kiwis. Well, Ms Tolley, in this country, Kiwis are working some of the longest hours for some of the lowest wages, and we're paying some of the highest costs of living in the entire developed world, and the whole country is sprinting just to keep where we are. We're not actually getting ahead as a country. The fact is we've got 290,000 Kiwi kids in poverty, yet for a country, and I hear the National backbench interjecting. Now, for a country which is feeding 20 million people around the world in our agricultural exports, it's a travesty that we've got hungry kids going to school without food, and your party voted against supplying them food at schools. And under National's New Zealand, we see the richest 1% control 16% of the country's wealth, and the bottom half, what do they have? They've only got 5%. And every year under National, it just gets worse and worse. But the fact is, it's bad for economic performance. The OECD have found that National's rising inequality has shaved 10% off our GDP over the last decade. And sure, there's been some productivity improvements, but they haven't flown through to the workers. So sure, we've got rising inequality, but we're also seeing rising generational inequality. Previous generations of Kiwis used to have an affordable education, state support to get into a first home, yet for Kiwis in their 20s or 30s, a good job, an affordable education and support to get into their first home, they're considered luxuries. You know, parents are struggling to raise their kids, burdened by massive student debt, the high costs of living in areas like electricity and food, and the majority of young Kiwis are forced to rent. In fact, we've had to create an entire new name for this new generation, which has been called Generation Rent. And for this generation, the dream of home ownership is slipping further and further out of reach. So we're seeing rising inequality, generational inequality, but perhaps the biggest is what's happening with the planet, which the last speaker just touched on, intergenerational inequality in terms of future generations' security, literally on the planet. And under National, over those 7 years, what we've seen is our emissions increased 20% since National came into power. They're forecast to increase 48% by the end of this decade. And just in the last week, within National's budget, Guess what there was, Mr Speaker? $31 million to subsidise polluters. National's ETS, emissions trading scheme, it's a complete farce. It's not incentivising the clean energy economy we should be developing, those clean energy jobs. In fact, it's subsidising polluters, and that's their vision for the future. However, there is a better alternative. That's why the Greens are putting up so many good ideas to rebalance our economy, to reduce inequality and give all Kiwis a fair go. Kia ora, Mr Speaker.